Switch topics now to something you've just briefly touched on, and that is, Israel right now. Because what's interesting is the United States foreign policy seems to be contradicting itself. On one hand, we want to, try Vladimir Putin for war crimes. We want to say that everything that Russia is doing is bad. But on the flip side, America is supporting an occupation, in Palestine. We are sending an endless amount of weapons and ammunition, billions of dollars to Israel. Netanyahu controls a tremendous amount of power inside the United States. Some would argue that even more power than the president, the way that he dictates the Israeli lobby. I want to shift and get your thoughts on this war, the other war that the United States is certainly involved in, because Israel is, heavily involved in this attack in Gaza, but it's the United States that is supporting that. So, Colonel, let me know your thoughts on the Israel-Gaza conflict as of today.
Well, setting aside whether or not the attack on 7 October was a genuine surprise to the Israelis, or somewhere along the line someone made a decision at high levels to let it happen, is beyond the scope of our discussion, because I don't know.
Right.
I have visited the outskirts of Gaza. I saw the security systems there. My impression was that it was expertly secured.
Right.
The notion that there could have been a surprise is hard for me to accept. They claim it was, so until we have proof to the contrary, we'll go along with it. But the bottom line is, defense of Israel does not require the wholesale annihilation or expulsion of 2.2 million people from Gaza, let alone additional hundreds of thousands or millions from the Western Bank. But that is essentially what has begun. The war is well beyond anything connected to 7 October. And the argument that in order to annihilate or destroy the roughly 25 to 29,000 Hamas fighters requires the mass expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands, either directly or through starvation or exposure to the elements, is ludicrous. I can't justify it. It's incomprehensible to me that anyone would do that in this day and age, that some alternative cannot be found. But that's the case right now. And if you raise objections to it, as I pointed out earlier, inside the Beltway, Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, no one has ever questioned that. Right. I have always supported the existence of Israel and its defense. I still do. Mm-hmm. But I can no more support the mass expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands of Arabs or millions of Arabs than I would the expulsion and murder of hundreds of thousands of Jews or millions. I can't. And I think a lot of us feel that way. But that doesn't seem to make much difference. The truth of what's happening rarely penetrates the mainstream media in the United States, as you know from personal experience. So that's the first thing. Second thing is this ugly tendency to characterize anyone that disagrees with the policy as a bigot or racist and anti-Semitic. It's just absurd nonsense. Has nothing to do with it. And then finally, as you pointed out, the Israeli lobby is enormously powerful. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, I think one can argue that they've done a brilliant job of making members of the House and the Senate heavily dependent upon income from them. Right. Now, when I say income, what I'm talking about is a situation where someone walks in and says, if you unconditionally support Israel in anything it wants, we will give you X amount of money. On the other hand, if you don't support Israel unconditionally for anything it wants, well then, we're going to give the money to your opponent. And since this money comes almost 100% from people inside the United States who are hedge fund managers, business tycoons, billionaires, and millionaires. In other words, what the people in Israel would call the Jewish diaspora, which is a way of referring to Jews that don't live in Israel, that are overseas. They would insist that this is not a foreign lobby at all, but a domestic lobby. But in reality, it's a foreign lobby. It's just that the money comes from within the country. So they control everything. They do. And they control substantial portions of, if not most of the media in Hollywood. They certainly control most of your news outlets. There are exceptions, obviously, but not terribly many. And so whatever you get is going to be slanted in favor of whatever the Israelis are doing. And there are a lot of people that don't want to challenge this. Now, I haven't talked about the evangelicals. That's an entirely different group of people who honestly believe that they should do this based on their interpretation of biblical text. I'm not going to get into an argument with people on theology. That's their business. I think they're misguided on these things. And I think what is morally right and what is morally wrong is absolutely clear in this setting at this time. But that's a matter for those people to sort through. But the bottom line is, under the circumstances, I don't see anything changing there. Now, what are we looking at in the near future? I think it's inevitable that Mr. Netanyahu will launch an attack on Rafah. I suspect he'll wait until Ramadan is at an end to do that.
Right.
Normally, not a great deal happens during Ramadan. An awful lot has happened beforehand. They still bomb the place routinely, but I just don't think that'll happen beforehand. But I could be wrong. Secondly, I think he will ultimately turn on Hezbollah and go north. Now, why? Why would he do this? Because he has a choice. He can either say, very well, this is out of control. This has gone too far, in which case he will be viewed as having surrendered the initiative. Remember, he has characterized this operation, and most Israelis see it as an either-or proposition. Either we do this or we die as a state, which I've never thought was true, but that's the way they see it. And their view, I think, now is can be justified in one sense. They've done so much damage to the Muslim Arab world, to the human beings that live there in the eyes of hundreds of millions of Muslims, that the possibility of going back to some sort of normalcy probably is very unlikely. I think he either surrenders or gives up, in which case he'll be thrown out of office because the population is still behind this, or he escalates. Now, if he escalates, he's betting heavily, particularly against Hezbollah, that we could be dragged in to support it with our air and naval power, because he's going to assume that he can't really defeat Hezbollah without assistance. He's probably right. The danger, of course, is that lots of people sitting on the sidelines may leave the sidelines. You attack Hezbollah, and you do that kind of damage, this may compel Iran to come to the aid of Hezbollah. They already have supported Hezbollah indirectly because of the Shiite Arab militias that you have down in Yemen, as well as in Iraq and Syria. Then you have the Turks. And Mr. Erdogan has talked a great game, but thus far has done nothing. In fact, Mr. Erdogan is selling oil to the Israelis, as well as food and other commodities that the Israelis need. His population is furious with him. They're very angry.